The slave auction at Ryan's Mart in Charleston, South Carolina on June 12, 1850, drew a crowd unlike any the city had seen in years. Wealthy plantation owners arrived from across the state, accompanied by their wives, an unusual occurrence, since slave auctions were typically considered unsuitable entertainment for refined ladies. But this was no ordinary auction. Word had spread for weeks about an exceptional offering, a man so extraordinarily handsome, so refined in manner and speech, so physically perfect that he'd been compared to classical Greek statues. Women who'd seen him whispered about him in parlors. Men discussed him in gentlemen's clubs. Everyone wanted to see if the rumors were true. The auctioneer, a seasoned professional named Thomas Crawford who'd conducted thousands of sales, stood on the platform and addressed the crowd of nearly 400 people packed into the auction house. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the finest male specimen to ever grace this auction block," Crawford announced. 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, perfectly proportioned, classically handsome features, educated, refined, skilled in languages and literature, trained in music and art. He represents the pinnacle of human form and cultivated ability. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Crawford gestured, and a man was brought forward onto the auction block. The crowd fell silent. The man was indeed extraordinarily handsome. He had symmetrical features that could have been carved by a master sculptor, intelligent eyes, a strong jaw, and a bearing that suggested dignity and confidence rather than the broken resignation typical of people being sold. His skin was light brown, suggesting mixed ancestry. He wore simple clothing, but he wore it with such natural grace that he looked elegant despite the plainness. His name was listed in the auction catalog as Gabriel, though like everything else about him, that would turn out to be only part of the truth. What was most striking about Gabriel wasn't just his appearance, it was the way he carried himself. He stood on the auction block with his head high, his expression calm and composed, looking out over the crowd as if he were a visiting dignitary rather than property being sold. There was no fear in his eyes, no shame, no desperation. Just a quiet, almost serene confidence that was utterly captivating. "Gabriel speaks 5 languages fluently," Crawford continued. "English, French, Spanish, Italian, and Greek. He reads Latin and has studied classical literature extensively. He's skilled at piano, violin, and voice. He can manage complex accounts and correspondence. And gentlemen, ladies," he paused for effect, "he's trained as a gentleman's valet and personal attendant to the highest standards." The crowd was mesmerized. Several women fanned themselves, clearly affected by Gabriel's presence. Men assessed him with the calculating eye of people evaluating an extremely valuable acquisition. "Bidding will start at $3,000, Crawford announced, an enormous sum when most enslaved men sold for $600 to $1,000. $5,000, a woman's voice called out immediately. Everyone turned in surprise. The bidder was Margaret Thornton, a wealthy widow in her late 40s who owned a large plantation outside Charleston. She was known for her imperious manner and her tendency to get what she wanted. $6,000, countered a male voice, Colonel James Whitfield, a plantation owner from the coast. $8,000. Margaret shot back without hesitation. The bidding escalated rapidly. $10,000. $12,000. $15,000. Bidders dropped out as the price climbed beyond reason, but Margaret Thornton and 3 other determined buyers continued. Standing at the back of the crowd, trying to see through the press of bodies, was a young black woman named Eliza. She was 24 years old, enslaved as a seamstress on a plantation 10 miles outside Charleston. Her owner had sent her to town on an errand, and she'd been drawn to the auction by the unusual crowd. Eliza watched Gabriel on the auction block, and unlike everyone else who was captivated by his appearance, she was watching his eyes. And what she saw troubled her. Because while Gabriel appeared calm and composed, Eliza could see something else in his expression, a flash of calculation when he looked at certain bidders, a barely perceptible tensing of his jaw when the price climbed, a momentary focus on Margaret Thornton that suggested, what? Recognition? Intent? Eliza had learned over 24 years of enslavement to read people carefully. To see past surfaces to the truths beneath. And her instincts told her that Gabriel was not what he appeared to be. $20,000. Margaret Thornton called out, her voice ringing with finality. The crowd gasped. $20,000 was an unprecedented sum, more than many plantations were worth. The remaining bidders fell silent. No one else was willing or able to match such an extraordinary price. $20,000, going once, Crawford called. Going twice. Sold to Mrs. Margaret Thornton for $20,000, the highest price ever paid for a male slave in Charleston history. The crowd applauded, partly for the spectacle, partly in acknowledgement of the record-breaking sale. Margaret Thornton approached the auction block to claim her purchase, her expression triumphant. "You're mine now," she said to Gabriel, her voice carrying a tone that made several people in the crowd exchange uncomfortable glances. "Yes, ma'am," Gabriel replied in a cultured voice with perfect diction. "I am honored to serve you." But Eliza, still watching from the back of the crowd, saw that flash in Gabriel's eyes again. And she suddenly understood, this man had wanted to be sold to Margaret Thornton. The entire auction, despite its apparent spontaneity, had somehow been orchestrated to achieve exactly this outcome. Why? What was Gabriel planning? Eliza had no reason to care about the affairs of wealthy white people. But something about the situation nagged at her. She'd heard things about Margaret Thornton, rumors whispered among enslaved people, stories about how she treated the men in her household, speculation about her appetites and her cruelties. If Gabriel had deliberately arranged to be sold to this woman, he was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. And Eliza had a terrible feeling that whatever his plan was, it would end badly for everyone involved. Over the next days, Eliza couldn't stop thinking about Gabriel and that auction. She asked careful questions among the network of enslaved people who communicated between plantations, sharing news and warnings. What she learned about Margaret Thornton was disturbing. The widow had gone through 7 male house servants in the past 3 years, an unusually high turnover. Some had been sold away suddenly. Others had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. One had been found dead, officially ruled a suicide though no one believed it. And all of them had been young, handsome men who'd been acquired at high prices and treated, strangely. "Mrs. Thornton has peculiar appetites," one older enslaved woman told Eliza carefully. "She acquires beautiful men and then, well, it's not proper to speak of it. But they never last long. Something always happens to them." Eliza felt sick. If Margaret Thornton was using her position as owner to force herself on enslaved men, and then disposing of them when she tired of them or they became problems, that was evil beyond normal evil. It was abuse of the most intimate and devastating kind. And Gabriel had deliberately sold himself to this woman. But why? Was he ignorant of her reputation? That seemed unlikely for someone so educated and apparently well-informed. Was he planning revenge? Suicide? What could possibly motivate someone to walk into such danger? 2 weeks after the auction, Eliza got her answer, though it came from an unexpected source. A man appeared at the plantation where Eliza worked, claiming to be a traveling preacher visiting enslaved communities. He was black, probably in his 50s, with an intelligent face and careful manner. He conducted a prayer meeting for the enslaved workers that evening, speaking about courage, faith, and the promise of freedom. After the meeting, the preacher approached Eliza specifically. "I'm told you're a woman who notices things," he said quietly. "That you were at Ryan's Mart 2 weeks ago and saw a remarkable sale." Eliza's guard went up immediately. "Who told you that?" "A mutual friend. Someone who believes you can be trusted." He handed her a small piece of paper. On it was written a single name, Gabriel. "You know him?" Eliza asked. "I know who he really is," the preacher said. "And I know what he's trying to do. He needs help, though he doesn't know it yet. And you're in a position to provide it." "Why would I help some man I don't know get himself killed by Margaret Thornton?" Eliza demanded. "Because he's not trying to get killed," the preacher replied. "He's trying to destroy a network of evil that's much larger than Margaret Thornton. A network that's been operating in secret for years, destroying lives. And if he succeeds, dozens, maybe hundreds, of people will be freed." He paused, studying Eliza's face. "But if he fails, he'll die, and the network will continue. That's where you come in." Over the next hour, in whispered conversation in the darkness outside the slave quarters, the preacher told Eliza the truth about Gabriel. His real name was Gabriel Freeman. He'd been born free in Philadelphia, the son of a successful merchant. He'd been educated at the finest schools, had studied in Europe, and had every advantage that wealth and freedom could provide. He was brilliant, cultured, and had a future of unlimited possibility ahead of him. Until 5 years ago, when his younger sister disappeared. Her name was Rebecca Freeman, and she'd been 18 years old when she vanished while visiting Baltimore. The family searched desperately, but she'd simply disappeared, no trace, no leads, no clues. 3 years later, Gabriel learned the terrible truth: Rebecca hadn't disappeared. She'd been kidnapped by a sophisticated network that specialized in capturing free black people, forging documents claiming they were fugitive slaves, and selling them into slavery in the Deep South. His sister was alive, enslaved on a plantation somewhere in South Carolina or Georgia. And the network that had taken her was still operating, still destroying lives. Gabriel had spent the last 2 years infiltrating the network. He deliberately allowed himself to be captured in Maryland, had gone through the process of being illegally enslaved, and had endured the horror of being sold at auction, all to get close to the network's operations and gather evidence that could destroy it. And Margaret Thornton, the wealthy widow who'd just paid $20,000 for him, was one of the network's key financiers and organizers. Gabriel's mission is to gather evidence from inside Thornton's household, the preacher explained. Documents, correspondence, financial records, proof of the kidnapping network's operations. He'll use his access as her personal servant to search her study and collect information. Then he'll escape and deliver that evidence to authorities who can act on it. "That's insane," Eliza said. "Thornton will never let him have that kind of access. And if she discovers what he's doing, she'll kill him," the preacher agreed. "That's why he needs help. Someone on the outside who can receive information he gathers, who can get messages to our network, who can provide an emergency escape route if things go wrong." "Why me?" Eliza asked. "I'm enslaved. I have no power, no resources, no." "You're a seamstress," the preacher interrupted. "You make deliveries to wealthy households in Charleston, including occasionally to Margaret Thornton's townhouse. You have legitimate reasons to be in places where you can make contact with Gabriel. And you're smart, observant, and brave enough to take risks when necessary." "How do you know I'm brave?" Eliza challenged. "Because you're asking questions instead of just accepting the evil around you," the preacher said. Because you noticed something wrong at that auction and couldn't let it go. Because you're still listening to me instead of walking away from this dangerous conversation. He had a point. Eliza could walk away right now, refuse to get involved, protect herself. But if she did, Gabriel would be alone in Margaret Thornton's household, risking his life to stop a network that had destroyed his sister and countless others. And Eliza thought about her own family, her mother, sold away when Eliza was 6. Her brother, separated from her when they were children and sent to a different plantation. All the people she'd lost, all the families torn apart by slavery's casual cruelty. If there was a chance to strike back against that system, to help stop even one part of it, shouldn't she take that chance? What would I have to do? Eliza asked. The preacher smiled slightly. For now, just watch. When you make deliveries to Thornton's household, pay attention. If Gabriel tries to contact you, and he will, once he knows you're the outside contact, be ready to receive whatever information he passes. And most importantly, trust no one except the people I designate. This network has eyes everywhere, and if they suspect Gabriel or you, they'll eliminate you both without hesitation. Who are you? Eliza asked. Really? My name is Samuel Washington, the preacher said. I'm a conductor on the Underground Railroad and an operative working to expose and destroy kidnapping networks throughout the South. I recruited Gabriel for this mission. And now I'm recruiting you. I haven't agreed yet, Eliza pointed out. You will, Washington said confidently. Because you understand what's at stake. And because you're the kind of person who can't stand by while evil triumphs. He was right. Eliza knew it even as she tried to resist the pull of the mission. She was going to help Gabriel, despite the risks, despite the danger, despite the very real possibility that it would get her killed. All right, Eliza said. I'll help. But Samuel, if Gabriel dies because of this mission, his blood is on your hands as well as Thornton's. I know, Washington said quietly. I live with that weight every day. But Eliza, sometimes the only way to fight evil is to take terrible risks. Gabriel understands that. And now you do too. 3 days later, Eliza made a delivery to Margaret Thornton's Charleston townhouse. And when she arrived, she came face to face with Gabriel for the first time since the auction. He was even more striking up close, handsome in a way that made people stare, cultured in a way that seemed impossible for an enslaved person. But Eliza also saw the wariness in his eyes, the tension beneath his composed exterior. Their eyes met briefly as she delivered her packages. And in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They were allies in an impossible mission, two people risking everything to fight a system that wanted to destroy them both. What neither of them knew yet was that Margaret Thornton was more dangerous than anyone had suspected. And that the network Gabriel was trying to expose had already noticed his presence and was preparing to eliminate him before he could gather the evidence he needed. The impossible secret of the most handsome male slave ever sold in Charleston was about to be revealed. And when it emerged, it would shake the city's foundations and expose evils that powerful people had worked very hard to keep hidden. Margaret Thornton's Charleston townhouse was an elegant 3-story structure on Meeting Street, furnished with expensive art and imported furniture. It was beautiful, refined, and, Gabriel quickly discovered, a prison designed with sophisticated cruelty. His first week in Thornton's household revealed the truth about his situation. He was assigned a small room on the 3rd floor, better quarters than most enslaved people had, but isolated. The windows were barred, ostensibly for security but actually to prevent escape. The door had a lock that could only be opened from the outside. He was allowed out of the room only when summoned by Thornton or when performing specific duties under supervision. He was not allowed to interact with the other enslaved people in the household except under direct supervision. He ate meals alone in his room. He had no freedom of movement. He was, essentially, kept in luxurious isolation. And Margaret Thornton visited him every evening. The visit started innocuously enough. She would come to his room after dinner, bringing wine, engaging him in conversation about literature, music, and art. Gabriel played his role perfectly, the cultured, grateful servant, honored by his owner's attention, eager to please. But he saw the predatory intent in Thornton's eyes. The way she looked at him wasn't like an owner assessing property, it was like a hunter stalking prey. She was waiting, patient, for him to become comfortable, to let down his guard. "You're quite exceptional, Gabriel," Thornton said during one of these visits, sitting close to him on the small couch in his room. "I've acquired many beautiful men over the years, but none with your combination of appearance and cultivation. You're perfect." "Thank you, ma'am," Gabriel replied, maintaining his deferential tone while internally revolting at her proximity. "I have plans for you," Thornton continued. "Important plans. But first, I need to know I can trust you." "Can I trust you, Gabriel?" "Yes, ma'am. Completely." "We'll see," Thornton said, her hand reaching out to touch his face. Gabriel forced himself not to flinch away. "Loyalty must be earned and tested. I'll know soon enough if you're truly devoted to me." After she left, Gabriel sat alone in his locked room and fought down panic. He'd known this assignment would be difficult, had known he'd face situations that would test his resolve. But experiencing Thornton's predatory attention was different from anticipating it. The way she looked at him, touched him, spoke to him, it all carried an implicit threat: submit to me, or face consequences. But Gabriel couldn't submit. His mission was too important. He needed to gather evidence of the kidnapping network's operations, and that meant accessing Thornton's private papers. The papers he'd seen briefly during his initial tour of the house suggested she kept extensive records, correspondence with network associates, financial accounts showing payments for kidnapped people, even lists of victims. If he could copy those documents and get them to Samuel Washington, they could destroy the entire network. Free dozens of people. Stop the kidnapping operation. And maybe, just maybe, find his sister Rebecca. But accessing Thornton's study required finding a way out of his locked room at night, when the household was asleep. It required lock picks and skills he'd learned specifically for this mission. And it required avoiding the household guards that Thornton employed to watch the property. Gabriel had been working on the problem for a week when opportunity presented itself in an unexpected form: Eliza. She arrived at the townhouse on a Thursday afternoon, delivering garments she'd altered for Thornton. Gabriel was summoned to carry the packages upstairs, which gave him a brief moment of proximity to Eliza. As they walked, Eliza whispered quickly, "Samuel sent me. I'm your outside contact. Do you have information to pass?" "Not yet," Gabriel whispered back. "I need access to the study. Can't get out of my room at night, doors locked from outside. Next delivery, I'll bring lock picks hidden in the hem of a jacket," Eliza replied. "Be ready." They separated before anyone could notice they'd been talking. But that brief exchange gave Gabriel hope. He wasn't alone in this mission. Help was available, even if limited. 5 days later, Eliza returned with another delivery. This time, she included a small cloth package sewn into the lining of a jacket she was delivering for Thornton. When Gabriel unpacked the delivery in his room later, he found the package, 2 lock picks and a small vial of oil to quiet squeaky hinges. That night, after Thornton's evening visit and after the household had settled into sleep, Gabriel used the lock picks to open his door. The lock was simple. Thornton had relied on psychological control and isolation rather than sophisticated security measures. He moved silently through the darkened house, avoiding the areas where guards patrolled, making his way to Thornton's first-floor study. That door had a more complex lock, but Gabriel had studied it during the day and knew how to defeat it. Inside the study, he found what he'd been looking for: files of correspondence and financial records. He worked quickly by candlelight, reading through documents and memorizing key information. He didn't dare take anything. Thornton would notice immediately if papers went missing. What he found was worse than he'd expected. The kidnapping network was enormous, operating in at least 6 northern states, with coordinators, kidnappers, forgers, corrupt officials, and buyers all receiving shares of the profits. Margaret Thornton was one of several major financiers, providing capital for operations in exchange for a percentage of sales. And the network didn't just target random free black people. They kept lists: people identified as having valuable skills, people with property or resources worth stealing, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. They planned their kidnappings meticulously, creating false documentation before the kidnappings even happened. Gabriel found a ledger showing over 200 people kidnapped in the past 5 years. Most had been sold in Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Some had died in captivity. A few had escaped. But the majority were still enslaved, their families having no idea where they'd disappeared to. And there, on a list dated 3 years earlier, Gabriel found his sister's name: Rebecca Freeman, age 18, kidnapped Baltimore, sold Mississippi plantation, Evergreen, owner Richard Clayton. His sister was alive. Enslaved on a Mississippi plantation. Gabriel felt tears streaming down his face as he read her name, felt grief and rage and desperate hope all at once. But he couldn't act on this information yet. First, he needed to copy enough evidence to expose the entire network. If he escaped now to find Rebecca, the network would continue operating, would destroy more lives. He had to think beyond his personal mission. Gabriel spent 2 hours in the study, memorizing names, dates, locations. Then he carefully returned everything to exactly how he'd found it and made his way back to his room, relocking the door from inside. He continued this pattern for 2 weeks, escaping his room at night, searching Thornton's papers, gathering information. During the day, he played his role perfectly: the devoted, cultured servant, grateful for Thornton's attention, seemingly content with his situation. But Thornton was growing impatient. Her evening visits became more overtly sexual, her touches more possessive, her expectations clearer. She expected Gabriel to submit to her advances, and she was growing frustrated with his careful deflections. "You're holding back from me," Thornton said one evening, her tone dangerous. "I've been patient, Gabriel. But my patience has limits." "I apologize if I've disappointed you, ma'am," Gabriel said carefully. "I'm simply overwhelmed by your attention. I need time to—" "You've had time," Thornton interrupted. 2 months. That's more than generous. Tomorrow evening, Gabriel, I expect your full cooperation. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Gabriel understood perfectly. She was demanding he submit to sexual exploitation, using the power dynamic of ownership to force compliance. If he refused, she'd punish him, possibly violently, possibly fatally. "Yes, ma'am," Gabriel said, his stomach churning. "I understand." After Thornton left, Gabriel faced a terrible choice: submit to her abuse and maintain his cover while continuing to gather evidence, or refuse and face whatever consequences she'd impose, likely ending his mission before he'd collected enough proof to destroy the network. He decided he needed to accelerate his timeline. He'd gathered substantial evidence already, enough to build a case against at least the South Carolina operations. He needed to get that information to Samuel Washington immediately, before Thornton forced a confrontation that would expose his true purpose. The next afternoon, when Eliza made another delivery, Gabriel managed to whisper, "Emergency. Need to pass information soon. Tomorrow night if possible." Eliza nodded almost imperceptibly and left. But Gabriel's plan was already falling apart, because someone had noticed his nighttime activities. One of the household guards, a man named Jacob, had been suspicious of Gabriel from the beginning. A free black man allowing himself to be enslaved seemed wrong to Jacob. And he'd noticed small signs, Gabriel moving through the house at odd hours, the study door being in slightly different positions than it had been locked, subtle disturbances that most people would miss. Jacob reported his suspicions to Margaret Thornton the next morning. "That man you bought, Gabriel, I think he's been sneaking around at night. Getting into places he shouldn't be." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "You're certain?" "Not certain, but suspicious. I'd recommend increased security. And maybe searching his room." Thornton considered this. She'd been so focused on Gabriel's physical appeal and her plans for him that she hadn't considered he might have ulterior motives for being in her household. But now that the possibility was raised, she realized how little she actually knew about him. "Search his room," Thornton ordered. "Thoroughly. And Jacob, find out everything you can about where he came from, who sold him, what his history is. I want to know who Gabriel really is." The search of Gabriel's room happened while he was downstairs performing duties. The guards found the lock picks, Eliza's picks that Gabriel had hidden under his mattress. When Gabriel returned to his room that evening and found Thornton waiting for him with the lock picks displayed on his table, he knew his mission had been compromised. "What are these?" Thornton asked, her voice cold and dangerous. Gabriel could have lied, could have claimed ignorance. But he was exhausted from weeks of maintaining his cover, disgusted by Thornton's attentions, and furious about what he'd learned about the kidnapping network. He decided to tell the truth, or at least part of it. "They're lock picks," Gabriel said calmly. "I've been using them to access your study at night. I've been reading your correspondence and financial records. I know about the kidnapping network, about the 200 people you've helped enslave. I know everything, Mrs. Thornton." Thornton stared at him in shock, then in rage. "You dare to spy on me? To violate my privacy? Who are you really?" "My name is Gabriel Freeman," he said. "I was born free in Philadelphia. I'm here because your network kidnapped my sister 3 years ago. I've spent 2 years infiltrating your operations to gather evidence that will destroy everyone involved. And I've succeeded. Even if you kill me now, the information I've gathered will reach people who'll use it against you." It was a bluff. Gabriel hadn't yet passed the information to Samuel Washington. But he needed Thornton to believe the evidence was already beyond her reach. Thornton's hand moved to a bell pull. She rang it sharply, and within moments, guards appeared at the door. "This man is a spy and a fraud," Thornton said. "Take him to the cellar. Secure him. I need to contact my associates and determine how to handle this situation." As the guards grabbed Gabriel and dragged him from the room, he caught a glimpse through the window of someone watching from across the street, a young black woman who looked like Eliza. He hoped she'd seen his capture. Hoped she'd get word to Samuel Washington. Hoped the network could be exposed even if he didn't survive. Because Gabriel Freeman, the most handsome male slave ever sold in Charleston, had been captured before completing his mission. And his fate now rested in the hands of people who'd already shown they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. Eliza had indeed seen Gabriel's capture. She'd been watching the Thornton house from across the street, waiting for an opportunity to make contact and receive whatever information Gabriel had gathered. When she saw guards dragging Gabriel toward the cellar entrance, she knew the mission had been compromised. She needed to act immediately. Eliza ran through the darkening streets to the church where Samuel Washington was staying, posing as a traveling preacher. She found him preparing for an evening service and pulled him aside urgently. "They've caught Gabriel." Thornton's guards took him to the cellar. "Samuel, we have to get him out now, or they'll kill him." Washington's face went grim. "Did he pass any information? Do we have evidence of the network's operations?" "I don't know. I never got close enough to make contact today." Washington thought quickly. If Gabriel hasn't passed the information yet, then everything he gathered is still in his head. We need him alive, not just to save him but to preserve the evidence. But a direct rescue attempt is dangerous. Thornton will have guards watching him. "So we don't do a direct rescue," Eliza said. "We create a distraction. Something big enough that Thornton has to focus her attention elsewhere, giving us time to get Gabriel out." "What kind of distraction?" Washington asked. Eliza thought about what she knew of Margaret Thornton, her vanity, her social standing, her terror of public scandal. "We expose her publicly. We create such a scandal that she's forced to defend her reputation, and while she's distracted, we extract Gabriel." "With what evidence?" Washington pointed out. "Gabriel has the evidence, but he hasn't passed it to us yet." "Then we use what we have," Eliza said. "Testimony from people who've survived her household. Rumors we can prove. We don't need to convict her in court, we just need to damage her reputation enough to create chaos and opportunity." Over the next hours, Washington and Eliza worked frantically. They contacted every person in their network, freed people who'd escaped from Thornton's household, enslaved people who'd witnessed her cruelty, abolitionists who'd been documenting the kidnapping network. They gathered testimony and wrote it up as a pamphlet, The Secret Crimes of Margaret Thornton, Widow, Socialite and Criminal. The pamphlet detailed her role in the kidnapping network, her abuse of enslaved men in her household, her financial crimes. They printed 500 copies overnight, using an abolitionist print shop. And at dawn, they distributed the pamphlets throughout Charleston, on church steps, in market squares, at the docks, everywhere people gathered. By mid-morning, all of Charleston was reading about Margaret Thornton's alleged crimes. The city erupted in scandal. Thornton's social peers were shocked and horrified. Her business associates distanced themselves. Reporters appeared at her door demanding statements. The sheriff's office sent deputies to question her. And while Thornton was frantically managing the public relations disaster, Eliza and Samuel Washington prepared to extract Gabriel. But they faced a problem. They didn't know where in the cellar Gabriel was being held, and they couldn't just walk into Thornton's house in daylight. The solution came from an unexpected source, one of Thornton's own enslaved workers, a woman named Sarah who'd been part of the household for years and had seen 7 men come and go under suspicious circumstances. Sarah approached Eliza at the market. "I heard you're trying to help that man, Gabriel. I know where they're keeping him. And I can help you get him out." "Why would you help?" Eliza asked cautiously. "Because I've watched Mrs. Thornton destroy man after man," Sarah said bitterly. "I've seen what she does to them. And I'm tired of being powerless to stop it. If you're really going to expose her and destroy her network, I want to help." Sarah provided detailed information about the cellar layout, the guard rotation schedule, and the location of Gabriel's cell. With this intelligence, Washington planned the rescue for that night. Meanwhile, Gabriel sat in the cellar, chained to a wall, waiting for whatever fate Thornton had planned for him. He'd been beaten by the guards, not severely, but enough to demonstrate their power. He'd been left without food or water. And he'd been told that Thornton was deciding what to do with him. Gabriel knew what deciding what to do with him probably meant: death, made to look like suicide or an escape attempt gone wrong. He'd failed in his mission. The evidence he'd gathered was still locked in his memory, useless unless he could somehow communicate it before dying. But then he heard sounds above, shouts, running footsteps, chaos in the house. He couldn't tell what was happening, but something had disrupted the usual routine. Hours passed. Then, near midnight, Gabriel heard the cellar door open and footsteps descending the stairs. He expected guards. Instead, he saw Eliza, Samuel Washington, and Sarah, working quickly to unlock his chains. "We're getting you out," Eliza whispered. "The house is in chaos. Thornton's dealing with a massive scandal. We have maybe an hour before someone checks on you. Can you walk?" "Yes," Gabriel said, though his legs were shaky from hours of sitting in chains. They moved quickly through the cellar and up a back stairway that Sarah knew about. The main floor of the house was indeed in chaos. Thornton was in her study with lawyers and associates, arguing about how to respond to the pamphlet that had been distributed. Guards were distracted, positioned to prevent reporters and curious citizens from entering rather than watching for escape attempts from inside. Sarah led them to a servant's entrance that opened onto an alley. "This is as far as I can go," she said. "If I'm caught helping you, I'll be sold or worse." "But Gabriel, destroy that woman. Expose what she's done. Make sure she pays for all the lives she's ruined." "I will," Gabriel promised. "Thank you, Sarah. What you've done is incredibly brave." They separated, Sarah returning to the house before her absence was noticed, Gabriel escaping with Eliza and Washington through the darkened streets of Charleston. They took Gabriel to a safe house, a warehouse owned by a free black merchant who sympathized with the abolitionist cause. There, finally safe, Gabriel could share what he'd learned. He dictated everything he'd memorized from Thornton's records: names, dates, locations, financial transactions. Washington wrote it all down, creating a comprehensive document detailing the kidnapping network's operations. "This is extraordinary," Washington said as Gabriel described the scope of the network. "With this information, we can expose conspirators in 6 states. We can identify dozens of victims. We can destroy the entire operation. But we have to move fast," Gabriel said. "Once Thornton realizes I've escaped, she'll destroy her records and warn her associates. We have days at most to act on this information." "What about your sister?" Eliza asked. "You found information about her?" "Yes," Gabriel said, his voice tight with emotion. "She's in Mississippi, enslaved on a plantation called Evergreen. Owner is Richard Clayton. I need to get her, but I know the mission has to come first. We expose the network, free as many people as possible, and then we get Rebecca," Washington said firmly. "Gabriel, you've done something extraordinary here. You've gathered evidence that will save dozens of lives. We'll make sure your sister is among them." Over the next week, Washington worked his contacts, abolitionist lawyers, sympathetic journalists, federal marshals investigating kidnapping operations. The evidence Gabriel had gathered was documented, verified, and distributed to everyone who could use it to bring the network to justice. Newspapers in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York published exposés detailing the kidnapping conspiracy. Federal marshals began making arrests. Victims were identified and legal processes began to establish their freedom. And Margaret Thornton's world collapsed. She was arrested on federal kidnapping charges based on the evidence from her own records. Her assets were frozen. Her social standing evaporated. The elegant widow who'd paid $20,000 for the most handsome male slave ever sold in Charleston was now facing decades in prison. But Thornton wasn't finished fighting. She hired expensive lawyers who argued that the evidence against her had been obtained illegally through theft and trickery. They claimed Gabriel had no right to access her papers, that anything he'd gathered was inadmissible. And technically, they had a point. Gabriel had broken into Thornton's study, had stolen information from private documents. Even though he'd been gathering evidence of crimes, he'd committed crimes himself in doing so. The case became complicated. Some charges were dismissed on technical grounds. Thornton's lawyers were masterful at creating reasonable doubt, at arguing that her involvement in the network was peripheral rather than central. It looked like she might escape serious consequences, might serve minimal time or even be acquitted entirely. That's when Eliza did something that changed everything. She'd been watching the legal proceedings with increasing frustration, seeing justice slip away on technicalities. She knew Thornton was guilty. She knew the network had destroyed hundreds of lives. And she refused to accept that wealth and legal maneuvering could prevent accountability. So Eliza did something extraordinarily brave and dangerous. She offered to testify against Thornton, publicly, as an enslaved woman with direct knowledge of the conspiracy. It was unprecedented. Enslaved people's testimony was generally not permitted in Southern courts, especially against white defendants. But Eliza's testimony wouldn't be in a Southern court, it would be in federal proceedings where different rules applied. I worked in households connected to the network, Eliza told federal prosecutors. I heard conversations. I saw documents. I witnessed transactions. I can provide first-hand testimony about how the conspiracy operated. Her testimony was devastating. She described overhearing plantation owners discussing kidnapped people, seeing forged documents claiming free people were fugitive slaves, witnessing payments being made for illegally enslaved workers. She named names, provided dates, corroborated everything Gabriel had documented. And because Eliza was willing to testify publicly, risking retaliation, risking her own safety, her testimony carried enormous weight. It proved that the conspiracy wasn't just documented in stolen papers but was witnessed by multiple people with direct knowledge. The federal case against Margaret Thornton and her associates strengthened. More arrests were made. More evidence was gathered. The network began to unravel completely. But Eliza's testimony came at a cost. Her owner, enraged that his enslaved seamstress had testified in federal proceedings, threatened to sell her to the Deep South as punishment. It was legal, he owned her, and he could do whatever he wanted with his property. That's when Gabriel did something that shocked everyone. He purchased Eliza's freedom. He'd been staying in Philadelphia, working with abolitionist lawyers on the network cases. But when he heard about Eliza's situation, he immediately returned to Charleston with money raised from abolitionist organizations specifically to buy and free people who'd been instrumental in exposing the kidnapping network. "You saved my life," Gabriel told Eliza as he handed her the manumission papers that proved her freedom. "You completed my mission when I was captured. You risked everything to testify. The least I can do is give you back your freedom." Eliza stared at the papers, legal proof that she was free, that she owned herself, that she'd never be property again. Tears streamed down her face. "What will you do now?" she asked Gabriel. "I'm going to Mississippi," Gabriel replied. "To find my sister. And I'm going to bring her home." Gabriel Freeman traveled to Mississippi in the fall of 1850, accompanied by federal marshals and armed with legal documents identifying him as a free man conducting official investigation into kidnapping operations. Finding the evergreen plantation wasn't difficult. It was a large property, well known in the region. But getting access to enslaved workers to search for his sister required careful planning and legal authority. The marshals presented owner Richard Clayton with a warrant. They were investigating his purchase of several enslaved workers whose freedom status was in question. Clayton was required to allow them to interview these workers and examine purchase documentation. Clayton was furious but couldn't legally refuse. He allowed the marshals access to his property, though he insisted on being present during all interviews. Gabriel searched among the enslaved workers, looking for his sister. And finally, he found her. Rebecca Freeman, now listed in plantation records as Rebecca, no last name, property of Richard Clayton, was working in the plantation's weaving house. She was 21 years old now, 3 years older than when Gabriel had last seen her. She was thinner, harder, with the guarded expression of someone who'd learned to survive trauma. When Gabriel approached her with the marshals, Rebecca didn't recognize him at first. Then their eyes met, and recognition dawned. "Gabriel," she whispered, disbelieving. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Rebecca," Gabriel said, tears streaming down his face. "I found you. I'm here to bring you home." But freeing Rebecca wasn't as simple as Gabriel had hoped. Clayton insisted she'd been legally purchased from a slave trader with proper documentation. The fact that she'd been kidnapped from freedom 3 years earlier didn't automatically invalidate the sale. Legally, Clayton had bought her in good faith and had property rights. The marshals explained that Rebecca's case would have to go through legal proceedings. They could take testimony from her about being kidnapped, could investigate the trader who'd sold her to Clayton, could build a case for her freedom. But it would take time, possibly months. Gabriel refused to accept that. "I'm not leaving my sister enslaved while lawyers argue over technicalities. We're taking her now." "That would be theft," one of the marshals warned. "You'd be stealing Clayton's property. You could face criminal charges." "Then charge me," Gabriel said. "I'll face any consequence. But I'm not leaving her here." What happened next became legendary in abolitionist circles. Gabriel, with help from the marshals who privately sympathized with his position even though they couldn't officially support it, arranged for Rebecca to escape during the night. The next morning, she was simply gone, vanished from the evergreen plantation. Clayton was furious and demanded the marshals find his stolen property. But the marshals conducted a thorough, slow, careful investigation that somehow never managed to locate the missing woman. By the time Clayton realized he'd been deliberately thwarted, Rebecca was already in Philadelphia, legally documented as a free woman based on testimony about her kidnapping and evidence from the federal investigation into the kidnapping network. Clayton filed lawsuits demanding Rebecca's return. But the publicity around the case, brother rescuing sister who'd been kidnapped and enslaved, generated enormous public sympathy. Abolitionist lawyers fought the lawsuit vigorously. And eventually, facing mounting legal costs and public condemnation, Clayton withdrew his claim. Rebecca Freeman was free. Legally, permanently free. The reunion between brother and sister was emotional and complicated. Rebecca had survived terrible trauma during her 3 years of enslavement. She'd been beaten, starved, overworked, and subjected to abuses she could barely speak about. "I thought I'd never see home again," Rebecca told Gabriel. "I thought I'd die on that plantation. I stopped hoping, stopped believing rescue was possible." "How did you find me?" Gabriel explained everything, how he'd infiltrated the kidnapping network, how he deliberately allowed himself to be enslaved to get close to the conspirators, how he'd gathered the evidence that exposed the entire operation. "You sold yourself into slavery to save me?" Rebecca asked, horrified. "Gabriel, you could have died. You could have been trapped there forever." "But I wasn't," Gabriel said. "And it was worth any risk to find you." Rebecca processed this slowly. "The things you must have endured. The things that woman, Margaret Thornton, she did she hurt you?" "She tried," Gabriel admitted. "But I was rescued before she could do her worst." "Rebecca, others suffered much more than I did. I was privileged, I went in knowing it was temporary, knowing I had a mission and support. You and the other victims had no such advantages. You're the brave ones." The federal investigation into the kidnapping network continued for over a year. By the time it concluded, over 60 people had been arrested across 6 states. Dozens of victims were identified and freed through legal proceedings. The network was destroyed completely, its operations exposed, its leaders imprisoned, its infrastructure dismantled. Margaret Thornton was convicted on federal kidnapping and conspiracy charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Many of her co-conspirators received similar sentences. Richard Clayton and others who'd knowingly purchased kidnapped people faced civil lawsuits and financial ruin even if they avoided criminal charges. And the publicity around the case, particularly Gabriel's story of deliberately selling himself to infiltrate the network, generated enormous attention to the kidnapping issue. Northern states strengthened protections for free black citizens. Federal laws against kidnapping were enforced more rigorously. The practice didn't end completely, but it became much more difficult and dangerous for the criminals who attempted it. Gabriel and Rebecca settled in Philadelphia, where they worked with abolitionist organizations to support other victims of kidnapping. Rebecca found her recovery challenging. The trauma of enslavement didn't simply disappear with legal freedom. But with time, therapy, and support, she began to heal. Eliza, freed by Gabriel's intervention, also moved to Philadelphia. She became a prominent voice in the abolitionist movement, speaking about her experiences as an enslaved woman who'd risked everything to expose the kidnapping network. "People think enslaved people are powerless," Eliza would tell audiences. "But we're not. We have courage. We have intelligence. We have the ability to fight back, even against systems designed to crush us. I was enslaved, but I helped bring down a criminal network that had destroyed hundreds of lives. That's power. That's agency. That's what resistance looks like." Gabriel became famous, or infamous, depending on one's perspective, as the man who'd been sold for $20,000, the highest price ever paid for a male slave in Charleston history. But his fame wasn't about his appearance or his accomplishments. It was about what his story represented, the lengths people would go to fight injustice, the courage required to confront evil, the possibility of resistance even from within slavery's darkest heart. "People ask me if it was worth it," Gabriel would say in interviews and speeches. "If risking enslavement, risking my life, was worth saving one person, my sister. The answer is yes. But it's also incomplete, because we didn't just save one person. The evidence I gathered freed dozens of people and destroyed a network that would have enslaved hundreds more. Every victim freed, every criminal imprisoned, every family reunited, that makes everything I endured worthwhile." In 1852, 2 years after his dramatic auction in Charleston, Gabriel was invited to testify before Congress about kidnapping of free black citizens. He sat before lawmakers and described the network's operations, the sophistication of their methods, the suffering they'd caused. "The kidnapping of free black people is not some minor crime committed by isolated criminals," Gabriel testified. "It's a systematic operation involving respected businessmen, corrupt officials, and plantation owners who knowingly purchase people they know are illegally enslaved. It's enabled by the same legal framework that supports slavery itself, the idea that black people can be property, that we have no rights worth respecting, that we can be bought and sold like animals. Until slavery itself ends, kidnapping will continue. Until the law recognizes the full humanity of black people, we'll remain vulnerable to these crimes. The solution isn't just prosecuting individual kidnappers, it's abolishing the system that makes kidnapping profitable and possible. His testimony was powerful and widely publicized. It contributed to growing Northern opposition to slavery and helped build support for what would eventually become the abolitionist movement's ultimate goal, ending slavery entirely. The Civil War came in 1861, 11 years after Gabriel's auction in Charleston. Gabriel, Rebecca, and Eliza all worked tirelessly for the Union cause. Gabriel served as an intelligence operative, using his skills at infiltration to gather information about Confederate operations. Rebecca worked with contraband camps, helping escaped slaves transition to freedom. Eliza organized support networks for colored soldiers and their families. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Gabriel stood with Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists to celebrate. "This is what we fought for," Gabriel told the crowd. Not just the end of legal slavery, but recognition that black people are human beings with rights and dignity. The proclamation doesn't solve everything, true equality will take generations to achieve. But it's a crucial step forward. Gabriel Freeman died in 1889 at age 67, having lived to see slavery abolished and having dedicated his life to fighting injustice in all its forms. His obituary in abolitionist newspapers described him as the man who sold himself to save others, whose courage in the face of impossible odds inspired generations of freedom fighters. Rebecca Freeman lived until 1901, spending her later years writing about her experiences and advocating for civil rights. Her memoir, From Captivity to Freedom, A Sister's Story, became an important historical document about the kidnapping networks and about survival and recovery from trauma. Eliza Washington, she took Samuel Washington's surname after marrying him in 1853, died in 1895, having spent over 40 years working for abolition and civil rights. Her testimony against Margaret Thornton was cited in legal scholarship as an important precedent for allowing enslaved people's testimony in federal proceedings. But perhaps the most important legacy of their story was what it represented about resistance and agency. The impossible secret of the most handsome male slave ever sold in Charleston wasn't just that he was free, not enslaved. It wasn't just that he'd orchestrated his own sale to infiltrate a criminal network. The impossible secret was that enslaved people, and those fighting slavery, had far more power than the system wanted to acknowledge. They had intelligence. They had courage. They had networks of support and resistance. They could fight back, could expose evil, could achieve justice even when every law and custom was arrayed against them. Gabriel's story proved that one person, willing to take extraordinary risks, could change hundreds of lives. That systematic evil could be fought and defeated. That justice, though difficult and costly, was possible. Years later, historians would debate the details, whether Gabriel's methods were justified, whether the risks he took were reasonable, whether his mission could have been accomplished with less danger. But the results were undeniable: a major kidnapping network destroyed, dozens of people freed, criminals imprisoned, and a powerful example set for others fighting injustice. The man who'd been auctioned for $20,000, who'd stood on the block in Charleston as the most coveted male slave ever sold, had never truly been enslaved. He'd been free in the only way that truly mattered, free in his mind, free in his purpose, free in his determination to fight for what was right regardless of cost. And that freedom, the freedom of conscience, of conviction, of courage, was something no auction block could sell and no chains could bind.